Have you ever looked around at the sheer chaos of the world, like the headlines, the division, just the absolute mess of it all, and thought, who is actually in charge here?
Oh, absolutely.
And honestly, why does it feel like I just don't belong in this place?
Yeah, it's a completely universal feeling, that sense of being a stranger in a strange land.
Right.
We look at the systems governing us, the cultural currents we're swimming in, and we instinctively feel this really profound disconnect.
Well, for you listening today, we're going to explore exactly why you feel that way. Today's stack of sources comes from some pretty comprehensive theological texts and charts from the Concordant Publishing concern.
Yes, specifically detailing a concept they call the Eonian Times.
Exactly. And the mission for this deep dive is to uncover exactly who is ruling our current era, why the universe is designed this way, and what practical role you as a believer are supposed to play while living as a guest in a world that, quite frankly, doesn't share your values.
And we really are going to be challenging some deeply entrenched mainstream assumptions here. I mean, these texts take a highly analytical, almost mathematical approach to the scriptures.
Yeah, they do.
They completely reframe traditional ideas about the timeline of eternity, the mechanics of evil, and just the overarching blueprint of God's plan.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Mm.
Because before we can even begin to figure out who is ruling the present world, we really have to understand how these sources define the architecture of time itself.
Right, which is the foundational premise.
Yeah, because mainstream theology usually operates on this binary system. There's the temporary physical world, and then there's a never-ending static eternity.
Exactly. But the concordant texts argue that translating the original Greek word aeon as eternity creates some massive logical contradiction.
It totally breaks the grammar.
It really does. I mean, the sources point out that translating aeon or eon in English as endless time just doesn't work. An eon is a specific long period of time with a definite beginning and a definite end.
It has boundaries.
Yes, it has boundaries. If an eon is eternity, you can't have a phrase like the eon of the eons, which, appears right there in the text.
Because you can't have an eternity of eternities. That makes zero sense.
Exactly. You also can't have the conclusion of the eons, because you obviously can't conclude something that never ends.
So, if we're translating a word with a definitive end as eternity, that doesn't just change a few verses, that breaks the entire timeline.
It shadows it.
Right. So if time isn't this never-ending scroll stretching into infinity, but rather a series of distinct chapters with very specific purposes, how does that change the landscape?
Well, the sources map out 5 distinct eons.
They describe it like a cosmic flight of stairs, don't they? Where the universe is slowly stepping up, step by step, out of the abyss of darkness into unending bliss.
That's a great way to put it. And understanding the mechanics of each step is crucial. According to the charts in the texts, the first eon spans from the initial creation to what they call the disruption of the world.
The disruption.
Yeah, the Greek word is katabole, which implies a literal casting down, a foundational ruin that left the earth formless and void. So that first eon had a purpose, but it ended in judgment.
And then the second eon begins with the restoration of the earth and the creation of Adam.
Right.
But that step also comes to a definitive end with the biblical flood.
Which brings us to the third step on this cosmic staircase. And that is exactly where we are right now. The texts call this the Present Wicked Eon.
The Present Wicked Eon. Wow.
Yeah, it began after the flood, and it'll conclude with the coming day of indignation.
I just want to pause on the names of these remaining eons because the contrast is so stark. We are in the Present Wicked Eon, but the texts outline that the fourth eon is the millennial kingdom.
Right, a period of direct iron rod rule by Christ.
Exactly. And then the fifth eon is the Eon of the Eons, featuring a new heaven and a new earth. And only after those 5 distinct eras are complete do the Eonian Times actually end.
Yes, and that is when death is abolished, and we enter a state of true, unending perfection.
So the architecture is highly deliberate. Each eon serves as a specific classroom for the universe, basically.
Precisely. The transition between them isn't arbitrary at all. It's driven by the failure of the previous era.
Okay, so if we've mapped out this massive architecture of time and we locate ourselves specifically on step 3, this present wicked eon, the text kind of forces us to look at our immediate environment.
It does.
If human independence is the defining characteristic of this era, who is actually running this specific step? Who's the landlord of the present wicked eon?
The texts provide a definitive answer to that, and it really explains the friction you experience every single day. Humanity is currently attempting to rule itself.
Trying to govern, build security, all that.
Right, trying to create societal welfare entirely independent of the deity. But the sources argue we are not actually the ones pulling the strings.
Wait, really?
Yeah. The true God of this eon is the adversary, Satan.
So people don't even realize they're part of a system they don't control.
Exactly. The sources talk about how the rulers of this world and their subjects are swept along by these spiritual, imperceptible forces.
The texts call them the world mights of this darkness, right?
Yes, and they reference the philosophical idea of the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times. You might think you're making independent, pragmatic choices at the ballot box or in your career.
But the texts argue you're actually being carried on a current designed by the adversary.
Exactly, because the adversary is the God of this eon. The religion, the politics, the philosophy, the business customs of this world, all of it is fundamentally engineered to be at variance with the spirit that believers have received.
Wow.
That's the source of your alienation. You are a citizen of a future eon living under the administration of the current one.
It makes me think of an analogy. It's kind of like being a guest at someone else's incredibly messy house.
Oh, I like that.
You walk in, there are dishes piled to the ceiling, there's mud on the carpet, the music is obnoxiously loud. Your immediate instinct is to grab a sponge, start rearranging their furniture, and demand they turn the volume down.
Because it's uncomfortable.
Right, but you don't have the right to paint their walls. And more importantly, you shouldn't get furious when things aren't per your liking, because it is fundamentally not your house.
It is so true.
We forget this guest status constantly. We try to force a temporary Christianized utopia on a world we don't even own.
We really do.
But if God is ultimately sovereign and the texts call him the king of the eons, why did he hand the keys of the house over to human misrule and the adversary in the first place?
What's fascinating here is that the texts argue humanity's misrule is a mathematically necessary phase of the universe's education.
Okay, how so?
Well, if men attained a temporary utopia apart from God-like, if we actually solved our economic crises, cured our diseases, and created perfect global governance without him, it would ultimately lead to far more catastrophic suffering in the long run.
Oh, because it would validate our independence.
Precisely. It would teach the universe that we don't actually need the creator.
Yeah.
The texts argue that any security or welfare built independently of God must be allowed to turn to corruption in our hands.
So the failure of human government right now is designed to empirically prove our absolute impotence without God.
Exactly.
Let's upgrade that messy house analogy then. It's really like a cosmic inoculation.
Oh, an inoculation.
Yeah, like to build permanent immunity to the disease of rebellion, you have to introduce a weakened strain of the virus, which is human independence and sin, into the system.
Right.
You let the universe experience how destructive it is, so the immune system recognizes it and rejects it for the rest of eternity.
That is a highly accurate way to frame the concordant view. And this is exactly where the texts tackle the problem of evil head on. They argue that evil, sin, and suffering are not eternal accidents that, caught God off guard.
They're temporary disciplinary tools.
Yes.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Let's look at the mechanics of that, starting with Adam. Because the sources point out a nuance I hadn't even considered.
About his innocence.
Yeah. Adam was created innocent, but he lacked the knowledge of good and evil. He only knew right and wrong.
Right. He knew what was commanded and what was forbidden.
Exactly. But he didn't deeply understand the moral weight of good and evil because he had nothing to contrast it with.
You can't truly appreciate light without experiencing darkness.
Right.
You can't deeply comprehend the magnitude of grace without the crushing reality of sin. The texts assert that creation was subjected to vanity or futility against its will. Creation didn't choose this state.
God subjected it.
He did, but he did so in expectation of a glorious future. Evil serves as the dark background, the necessary foil, to fully display God's grace, his wrath, his love, and his righteousness.
Wait, hold on. The sources state that God uses the sins of men as material to work out salvation. They even quote Isaiah 45:7, where God explicitly says he is the creator of evil.
Yes, they do.
So if God creates the evil conditions that lead to suffering, how do these texts defend him from being the author of sin itself? Because, that feels like a massive theological tightrope. How does the concordant view justify that distinction?
It's a really critical distinction in their theology. They differentiate between relative evil and absolute sin.
Okay.
When Isaiah 45:7 says God creates evil, the Hebrew word there refers to calamity, adversity, distress. basically the destructive conditions of this eon.
Ah, okay.
So God authors the affliction, the storm, the collapse of systems. But he is not the author of moral failure or sin.
I see.
He creates the arena of adversity, and humanity in its weakness and independence generates the sin. God then uses the resulting suffering from our sin to teach the universe the destructiveness of independence.
It's easy to look at a chart of eons and theoretically say, suffering is a disciplinary tool. But when someone listening is in the thick of a tragedy, when they're watching the news or dealing with an illness or facing severe injustice, how do these texts suggest they actually apply that without feeling incredibly cynical about God's plan?
That's the challenge, isn't it? The natural human reflex is to view affliction as a sign of God's anger. We ask, why is God punishing me?
Right, exactly.
But the texts are absolutely adamant that for the believer, suffering is never a vindictive penalty for past sins. Instead, it's framed as a privilege, albeit a very painful one.
A privilege.
Yeah, it's a corrective process that prepares you for your future role in the celestial realms.
So the logic being, if you don't intimately understand the destruction of sin, how can you effectively govern or minister to a universe recovering from it in the eons to come?
Yes. You are being trained by your exposure to this messy, evil eon. The chaos isn't pointless. It's a highly curated curriculum. God is permitting this dark man's day so that when he eventually intervenes, the contrast is undeniably absolute. The ultimate goal of all these eons, the final destination of that cosmic flight of stairs, is to reconcile the entire universe so that, as the text quote, God becomes all in all.
Not just some things and some people, but all in all.
Exactly.
Okay, so if we accept that we are just guests in a temporary educational era of chaos, that fundamentally changes the practical playbook for tomorrow morning.
It completely flips it.
When you wake up, turn on the news, and see the house is still a mess, what is your actual role?
The texts emphasize that your primary directive is to be an ambassador of peace.
Okay.
And this is rooted in a stunning truth about the current administration of God. We're living in what the sources call a dispensation of conciliation.
Let's define dispensation for a moment, because in this context, it isn't just like a theological buzzword. It refers to a specific administration or a set of household rules that God employs during a particular era.
Correct. The rules of engagement change depending on the eon and the dispensation. Right now, the administration is conciliation. That means God is currently at peace with the world. Through the cross, God is not presently reckoning men's offenses against them. He's not actively pouring out his indignation or wrath on the nations right now. He's offering a unilateral treaty of peace.
So even when the world is acting in total defiance, God has his weapons lowered.
Yes.
And if the king of the eons has his weapons lowered, what business do we have drawing ours?
None whatsoever. Therefore, believers must not antagonize the world or the celestial powers. The texts instruct us to lead a mild and quiet life.
Mild and quiet.
Right. And we don't do this passively because we are weak or defeated. We do because we're actively aligning our attitude with God's current attitude.
Right. You don't lead a quiet life because you think God is going to magically remove all the wicked politicians or fix the economy tomorrow. You lead a quiet life because you start looking at the people around you the way God does, as potential believers. Even the most frustrating, antagonistic person you encounter is someone who will ultimately be reconciled at the consummation of the eons. When you internalize that, you stop fighting them. You stop surging hither and thither with anxiety over culture wars.
You stop trying to forcefully paint the walls of the messy house. Instead, your job is to hold your celestial status by faith. To survive the environment of the present wicked eon, the texts urge believers to put on the panoply of God, the full armor.
But the texts are very specific about what that armor is actually for. It is not for launching an offensive crusade to take over the Earth's institutions.
No, it is to withstand. It's a defensive posture to stand firm in the celestial conflict. The forces governing this eon want to drag you down into what the texts call soulish emotions.
Let's break down that distinction between soulish and spiritual, because it's vital here.
Soulish emotions are driven by the senses, the flesh, and the immediate physical environment.
Like the panic you feel when reading a bad headline.
Yes, or the anger you feel when someone cuts you off. It's reacting strictly to the stimuli of the present wicked eon. The armor of God protects you from that, allowing you to maintain a spiritual attitude.
An attitude seated among the celestials.
Right, driven by faith in the overarching plan, rather than sight of the immediate chaos.
Because those spiritual forces want you stressed out. They want you terrified of the future. But if you have the panoply on, you adopt a posture of thanksgiving and expectation. You become free of pressure. You become free of haste.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, enjoying a rich restfulness and peace right in the middle of this dark eon is the very thing God eagerly longs to see from us.
Oh, that makes total sense.
Right. It's easy to be peaceful in the millennial kingdom when Christ is ruling with a rod of iron and justice is immediate. But to exhibit total peace and profound restfulness while the house is burning down around you today, that proves the absolute sufficiency of God's grace. It is a powerful testimony to the celestial powers watching us.
That is an incredibly empowering shift in perspective. You don't have to fix the eon. You just have to faithfully represent the God who is eventually going to conclude it. Your peace is your protest against the chaos.
Beautifully said.
And that peace is sustained by properly categorizing your expectations. The texts warn against trying to drag millennial kingdom dynamics like, guaranteed physical health, immense wealth, or direct earthly governance into this current eon.
Mixing up the eons is a recipe for despair. Those physical earthly blessings are reserved for the next chapter. Our current blessings in this eon are spiritual.
Right.
When we confuse the two, when we expect the world to be fair and prosperous right now, we set ourselves up for profound disappointment. We get mad at the landlord of this eon for not fixing the plumbing when we should just be thankful we have a permanent home waiting for us in the next.
Okay, let's quickly recap the monumental journey we've been on today. You, listening, are a celestial guest currently navigating the third step of a five-step cosmic journey, the present wicked eon. The landlord right now is the adversary, and the world is running on a current of human independence from God. The chaos, the mess, the suffering, none of it is a cosmic accident. And it isn't a vindictive punishment for your past. It's a temporary, highly controlled curriculum, a cosmic inoculation designed by God to teach the entire universe the absolute necessity of his light and the destructiveness of sin.
And your job isn't to fix the house. Your job is to be an ambassador of peace, living in the reality of God's current administration of conciliation. You endure the mess with radical thanksgiving, knowing that the eons have a definitive conclusion and that God's ultimate goal is to become all in all.
And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with one last mind-bending concept from these sources to mull over on your own. We've talked a lot about Christ returning to rule the coming eons, to wield the scepter, to fix the broken systems, to enforce justice in the millennial kingdom. We naturally think of his kingdom as the ultimate eternal endpoint. But these texts reveal a stunning twist in their analysis of the scriptures. At the very end of the final eon, the eon of the eons, when the last enemy, death, is finally abolished and universal perfection is actually achieved, Christ does something unthinkable.
It really is incredible to think about.
He abdicates his throne, he voluntarily gives up the kingdom and hands it over to God the Father.
It is the ultimate act of submission and really the logical conclusion of a perfectly executed plan.
Think about the mechanics of what that means. Government itself, even divine, perfect government wielded by the Son of God, eventually becomes completely obsolete.
Right.
Why? Because mankind will finally yield perfect, loving, filial obedience directly to God as a father. There will be no need for rules or mediation or authority structures. Imagine a future so unimaginably, flawlessly perfect that the very concept of ruling simply vanishes into thin air because it's no longer needed to maintain peace.
That is something to look forward to.
So tomorrow morning, when you walk out into the messy house of this present eon, remember that you are just a visitor. You don't have to clean the mud off the carpets, and you don't have to yell over the loud music. You can just smile, put on your armor of peace, and know exactly how the architecture of time ends. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Step out into the chaos with a little more peace and a lot more perspective.